A Trump supporter waved his flag in a royal guard's face, thinking tradition meant weakness. But one response from the guard turned his political rally into a history lesson he never expected. Here's what happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel as tomorrow. At the same time, we bring you another remarkable display of Royal Guard valour that you won't want to miss. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as Jackson Miller emerged from the crowd, his red MAGA hat standing out like a beacon against the sea of tourists. His stance was aggressive, shoulders squared beneath his Trump 2024 t-shirt as he shouldered his way through the gathering of international visitors. Now this, right here, Jackson's voice carried across the courtyard with deliberate volume, is exactly what President Trump's been talking about. Look at all this. Fancy gates, fancy guards, fancy everything. While real leaders are making real decisions, these folks are playing dress-up. The Royal Guard stood at his post, scarlet uniform pristine in the morning light, bearing the same dignified posture that had guarded these gates through centuries of both praise and criticism. His eyes remained fixed forward, his discipline unwavering as Jackson's voice grew louder. "You know what Trump says about all this ceremonial nonsense?" Jackson continued, his Texas drawl thick with disdain. "Says it's a waste of taxpayer money. And he's right. Look at this guy just standing here. In America, we put our soldiers to real use, not playing statue for tourists." Several British citizens in the crowd exchanged glances, their expressions tightening at each word. A mother pulled her young son closer, whispering something that made him lower his pointing finger. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Jackson moved closer to the guard, his movements deliberate and provocative. "Hey, buddy," he called out, tapping the brim of his MAGA hat. "Got a real leader back home who could teach your monarchy a thing or two about running a country. None of this standing around looking pretty. Trump gets things done." The guard remained motionless, but there was something in his bearing, a subtle tension visible only to those who knew what to look for, that suggested gathering storm clouds. The morning sun caught his brass buttons, their gleam somehow making Jackson's next words seem even harsher. "President Trump's right about you Brits," Jackson announced, playing to his growing audience. "You're living in the past while America's leading the future. These guards, this palace, it's all just a tourist trap, just like Trump's been saying." The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Jackson Miller more about leadership, respect, and tradition than any political rally ever could. "You want to know the real difference?" Jackson continued, encouraged by the attention he was drawing. "While your guards are standing here like mannequins, Trump's busy making America stronger than ever. That's what I call leadership, not this monarchy mumbo-jumbo." He circled closer to the guard, his voice taking on the same rehearsed cadence he'd learned from countless political rallies. "President Trump tells it like it is, says the British monarchy is just a drain on resources. And look at this." He gestured expansively at the palace gates. "He's absolutely right. All show, no substance." An elderly gentleman in a Royal Marines veteran's blazer stepped forward, campaign medals glinting in the morning sun. "Young man," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak, "you might want to reconsider." "Reconsider what?" Jackson cut him off with a dismissive wave. "The truth? Trump's been saying it for years. You Brits are stuck in the past. While we've got a leader making real changes, you're all bowing and scraping to a family that hasn't done anything except wave from balconies." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the growing crowd. Two middle-aged American tourists shook their heads and moved away, clearly trying to distance themselves from their countrymen's behaviour. But Jackson, emboldened by what he mistook for attention rather than mounting tension, pressed on. "President Trump understands modern leadership," he declared, moving even closer to the guard. "He says these European monarchies are just playing pretend while America does the real work of leading the free world. And this guy, He jerked his thumb toward the guard's impassive face. This is exactly what Trump means when he talks about wasted potential. The veteran's companion, another former serviceman, placed a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder. Both men watched with the patient gravity of those who understood service in a way Jackson couldn't comprehend. "Look at him, just standing there." Jackson's voice grew louder, more theatrical. "Trump would never waste military personnel like this. In America, we put our soldiers to work, not dress them up like toy soldiers for tourists to gawk at." A young British mother covered her daughter's ears, her face flushing with anger. Nearby, a group of international tourists watched with growing discomfort as Jackson continued his tirade. "You know what Trump says about tradition?" He was practically shouting now. "Says it's just an excuse for not moving forward. And he's right. While you're all caught up in your royal ceremonies and fancy parades, America's showing the world what real power looks like." The guard remained motionless, but there was a subtle change in his bearing, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his jaw, not breaks in protocol, but rather the minute adjustments of a warrior choosing his moment. "President Trump's got it figured out," Jackson declared, pulling out his phone to show anyone within reach his collection of Trump rally photos. "Real leadership isn't about standing guard over old buildings. It's about action. While your guards are playing dress-up, Trump's making deals, building walls, showing what a real leader does." The veteran took another step forward, his medals catching the light. "Son, you're confusing volume with valor." "No, what I'm doing," Jackson interrupted again, his voice carrying the practiced certainty of someone who'd never had his views seriously challenged, "is speaking truth to power, just like Trump does. He says the British monarchy is outdated, overrated, and overfunded. And looking at this display right here," he gestured at the guard's ceremonial uniform, "I'd say he's right on the money." The morning air grew heavier with tension as Jackson, oblivious to the mounting disapproval around him, prepared to escalate his performance further. The guard's shadow fell across his feet like a sword waiting to fall, but Jackson was too caught up in his own rhetoric to notice the warning signs of what was to come. "Let me tell you something about real power," Jackson announced, pulling up Trump's latest social media post on his phone. "While your guard here stands frozen, Trump's got 20 million followers hanging on his every word. That's influence, that's leadership, not this ceremonial nonsense." His voice took on a mocking tone as he read aloud. Wait, here's another one from last week's rally." Jackson pulled up another post on his phone, his excitement building. "Britain's military budget could fit in Trump Tower's elevator. Now that's what I call a real burn." He played to his audience like a performer warming up. "And here's what the president said about your changing of the guard ceremony. Says it's like a Broadway show without the talent." A young British Army officer in civilian clothes had joined the growing crowd, his jaw tightening at each word. Next to him, an American tourist wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap shook his head in disgust. "You know what really kills me, though?" Jackson continued, scrolling through his phone with theatrical flourish. "Your monarchy couldn't even handle a little family drama without falling apart. Trump's got 3 marriages and still runs an empire. Meanwhile, your royal family can't even—" "That's quite enough." The American veteran stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd fought alongside British forces. "Son, you're disrespecting more than Oh, look, another one stuck in the past." Jackson spun toward him, riding high on his own rhetoric. "Let me guess, you probably think these fancy-dressed guards actually mean something. Trump's got security teams that could buy and sell this whole palace guard routine." He pulled up yet another social media post, practically bouncing with excitement. "Here's what Trump said about your military parades, all show, no go. And these guards," he gestured dismissively, "they're like those mechanical bears at Chuck E. Cheese, except at least those move occasionally." The British Army officer's hands had clenched into fists, but years of discipline kept him in place. The American veteran placed a calming hand on his shoulder, both men united in their silent disapproval. "Trump showed us what real military strength looks like. Jackson declared, pulling out a small Bluetooth speaker from his pocket. None of this standing still nonsense. Here, let me play you his latest speech about European military weakness. He specifically mentions these toy soldiers. Before he could press play, the British officer stepped forward. That device isn't permitted this close to the palace grounds. See? More rules, more restrictions. Jackson tucked the speaker away, but found new energy in the interruption. That's exactly what Trump's been saying. You're all so caught up in your little rule book that you can't even handle a little free speech. Back home, we're building a space force while you're still playing medieval castle. Britain needs to modernise. The age of kings and queens is over. That's what Trump posted just yesterday. And he's right. This whole setup is like a medieval theme park. The veteran's medals clinked softly as he straightened his posture, years of military bearing evident in his stance. Those are mighty strong words from someone who tells it like it is, Jackson cut in, his face flushing with excitement. You bet they are. Trump says your monarchy's just burning through taxpayer money while pretending to matter. Look at this guard, standing here like it's still 1776. You know what Trump would do with these palace grounds? Turn it into something useful, maybe a nice golf course. The crowd's discomfort had transformed into palpable anger. A group of British schoolchildren were quickly ushered away by their teacher, who shot Jackson a look of pure disgust. Even some American tourists wearing MAGA hats began to edge away, embarrassed by the extremity of his behaviour. President Trump understands what real security looks like, Jackson continued, gesturing at the guard's ceremonial rifle. Not these museum pieces. While you're playing soldier, Trump's building up the strongest military in world history. He says European armies are a joke, and looking at this display, I can see why. The guard's grip on his rifle tightened imperceptibly, the only visible sign of response to the escalating provocation. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the growing tension in the courtyard. You know what else Trump says? Jackson pulled out another phone, this one displaying Trump's latest interview. Says the special relationship between the US and UK is too special. We're carrying all the weight while you folks play dress-up with your ceremonies and traditions. The veteran's companion stepped forward, his own service medals gleaming. Young man, you're speaking of things you don't understand. Oh, I understand plenty, Jackson sneered. Trump's taught us all about how these old European powers are just riding America's coattails. While we're securing world peace, you've got your military standing guard over tourist attractions. He moved even closer to the guard, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that still carried across the courtyard. Trump says the monarchy's just a puppet show. That real leaders don't need crowns and ceremonies. They need guts. They need strength. They need to be more like him. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle, but increasingly hostile to Jackson's performance. A young British soldier in civilian clothes watched from the periphery, his face a mask of controlled anger. Look at this uniform. Jackson reached out, as if to touch the guard's sleeve, stopping just short of contact. All fancy and red, like a Christmas nutcracker. Trump says European militaries are just for show, and now I can see exactly what he means. While we're building space forces and cyber commands, you're polishing buttons and adjusting hat straps. His voice rose again, taking on the cadence of a campaign speech. President Trump's vision for America doesn't include bowing to outdated institutions. He says monarchies are relics, and these guards, they're just expensive lawn ornaments. In Trump's America, soldiers are warriors, not tourist attractions. The veteran's hands clenched at his sides, decades of military discipline barely containing his response. The guard remained motionless, but there was something different in his stillness now. Not the calm of ceremony, but the tension of a coiled spring. You want to know the real truth? Jackson was practically shouting now, his face red with excitement. Trump's right about everything. Your monarchy's a joke, your military's a costume party, and these guards, they're just proof that Britain's living in the past while America's charging into the future. He turned to address the crowd directly, playing to an audience that had long since turned against him. This is why Trump's going to make America even greater. Because we don't waste our time with this medieval pageantry. We don't need men in fancy uniforms pretending to guard empty traditions. Trump says his next words would never come, because at that moment something shifted in the air. A change so subtle yet so profound that even Jackson, lost in his own rhetoric, felt it. The guard's presence had transformed from ceremonial to commanding, though he hadn't moved an inch. The morning air crackled with tension as Jackson prepared to learn exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. You know what Trump says about ceremonies? Jackson's voice rose higher, sensing the shifting atmosphere but misreading it entirely. Says they're just distractions from real leadership. While your guard here plays statue, Trump's busy reshaping the world order. He pulled out his phone again, fingers trembling with excitement as he pulled up another Trump quote. Here's what a real leader sounds like. America doesn't need fancy uniforms and marching bands to show strength. That's old world thinking. That's Trump speaking truth about your little costume party here. The veteran took another step forward, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Son, you're about to learn. Learn what? Jackson spun around, his mega hat slightly askew. That your guard here can't move, can't speak, can't do anything but stand there while I tell the truth about your outdated system. Trump's right. This whole setup is just a tourist trap. He turned back to the guard, moving close enough that his breath fogged the polished brass buttons. President Trump says European armies are weak because they're too busy with tradition to focus on real strength. Looking at you, I'd say he's spot on. All dressed up with nowhere to go, while American forces are actually protecting the free world. The crowd had fallen completely silent now, sensing the approaching storm. Even the palace pigeons seemed to hold their breath as Jackson delivered his final provocations. Trump's shown us what real leadership looks like, he declared, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small American flag. Not this monarchy nonsense, not these toy soldiers playing guard duty. Real American leadership, the kind that doesn't need fancy uniforms to prove its worth. He waved the flag inches from the guard's face. See this? This is what real power looks like. Not your queen, not your palace, not your little ceremonies. Trump says... The guard's voice cut through the air like a blade, quiet, yet carrying enough authority to freeze Jackson mid-sentence. Mr. Miller, the guard spoke, his eyes still fixed forward, his posture perfect. Since you're so fond of quoting presidents, perhaps you'd be interested in what President Eisenhower said about the British monarchy. Jackson's mouth fell open, the small flag dropping to his side. The guard knew his name. More than that, the guard had spoken, and there was something in his voice that commanded absolute attention. Or maybe, the guard continued, his tone carrying decades of military precision, you'd prefer to hear Winston Churchill's response when asked about the relationship between American strength and British tradition. The veteran's face broke into a slight smile, recognition flickering in his eyes. He'd seen this moment coming, had waited for it with the patience of someone who understood true strength. But first, the guard's eyes finally moved, locking onto Jackson with sniper's precision. Let's discuss your remarkable understanding of military history, diplomatic relations, and the true meaning of leadership. Since you've been so eager to educate us all about President Trump's views, allow me to provide some historical context that seems to have escaped your attention. Jackson took an instinctive step backward, his previous bravado evaporating under the guard's steady gaze. The flag in his hand seemed to droop, as if suddenly aware of how it had been misused. You see, Mr. Miller, the guard's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned their position through more than ceremony. While you've been quoting social media posts about military strength, I have served alongside American forces in actual combat. Would you like to hear about what your fellow countrymen really think about British military tradition? The morning sun seemed to intensify, casting the guard's shadow across Jackson like a judgment. The crowd held its breath, knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. A moment when ceremony gave way to substance, when tradition revealed its steel core. Jackson opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since he'd started his performance, he faced something his rehearsed talking points couldn't handle. Genuine authority backed by real experience. The history he'd casually dismissed was about to teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. First, the guard's voice remained measured, each word precise as rifle fire. Let's address your understanding of military effectiveness. While you were reading social media posts about strength, I was serving in Helmand Province alongside US Marines. Would you like to know what those Marines thought about British military tradition? The guard's eyes hadn't moved from Jackson's face, which was rapidly losing its previous confidence. They understood something you seem to have missed, that these ceremonial guards you mock are active duty combat soldiers. Every man who stands this post has earned it through service that would make your political rhetoric wither in shame. But Trump says, Jackson started weakly. Let me tell you what President Trump himself said when he actually visited these grounds, the guard cut in smoothly. He remarked on the professionalism of our forces, showed proper respect for our institutions, understood the difference between political showmanship and genuine military tradition. The veteran nodded slowly, his medals catching the light as the guard continued. You speak of real leadership while mocking centuries of proven service. Do you know why we maintain these traditions, Mr. Miller? Not for tourists, not for show. We stand guard because it reminds us and the world that some things transcend political moments, that duty, honour and service remain constant while politicians come and go. Jackson's MAGA hat seemed to droop on his head as the guard's words struck home with surgical precision. You've been quoting social media about military strength. Let me quote something more substantial. During the Battle of Britain, when American forces hadn't yet joined the war, British soldiers stood their ground against tyranny, not because it was politically expedient, but because it was right. These ceremonial uniforms you mock, they've been decorated in every major conflict of the modern era. The guard's voice took on a deeper resonance. While you were rehearsing political talking points, I was training with US Special Forces. They understand what you don't. That our shared military heritage isn't about who's stronger or better. It's about standing together against common threats, about mutual respect earned through shared sacrifice. Jackson's phone had disappeared into his pocket, his previous desire to record everything suddenly forgotten. You speak of wasted resources, the guard continued, his bearing unchanged, but his presence filling the courtyard. Let me educate you about efficiency. Every guard you see here is combat ready, trained in modern warfare, and prepared to deploy anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. We maintain tradition, not because we're stuck in the past, but because we understand that values endure while political winds change. The crowd had grown utterly silent, absorbing a history lesson few had expected. These buttons you mocked, the guard's voice carried a hint of steel. They're polished by hands that have fired weapons in defense of the same freedoms you claim to champion. This uniform you ridiculed, it's worn by soldiers who fought alongside your countrymen in every major conflict of the modern era. We stand guard here, not because we have to, but because we've earned the right to represent centuries of shared sacrifice and alliance. The morning sun had reached its peak, casting no shadows for Jackson to hide in. Since you're so fond of presidential quotes, the guard's words carried the weight of history, let me share one from President Reagan. No two nations have done more for the defense of freedom than America and Britain. He understood what you've forgotten. That true strength lies not in mocking allies, but in standing together. Jackson's previous bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he'd gravely miscalculated. So the next time you wish to discuss military effectiveness, the guard concluded, his voice carrying both authority and dignity, I suggest you first learn the difference between political rhetoric and battlefield reality. These gates we guard, they represent not just British tradition, but the enduring alliance between our nations, an alliance forged in blood and sacrifice, not in social media posts. With perfect military precision, the guard's eyes returned to their forward position, his final words carrying across the silent courtyard. "That will be all, Mr. Miller. I trust you've learned something about real leadership today." But Jackson, his face now flushed with a dangerous mixture of humiliation and defiance, wasn't finished. The guard's eloquent response had only stoked the burning anger of someone whose deeply held beliefs had been publicly challenged. "Oh, I've learned something all right," he snarled, his voice cracking with rage. "Learned that you're all brainwashed by your precious monarchy. Trump's right. You're all just puppets defending a dead system." His hands were shaking now, but not from shame, from a desperate need to reclaim his perceived authority. The crowd's sympathetic silence transformed into something darker as Jackson raised his voice again. "You think your fancy speech changes anything? Trump says your whole royal family is just a bunch of—" A ripe tomato caught him squarely in the chest, staining his MAGA shirt with a splash of red. A market vendor had decided enough was enough. "How dare you!" Jackson started, but a barrage of eggs followed, their yellow yolks marking him like badges of shame. The crowd, which had respectfully absorbed the guard's history lesson, now delivered their own form of justice. "Your monarchy's nothing but a bunch of—" His next words were cut off by a rain of vegetables. Someone's shoe sailed past his head. The British public, pushed beyond tolerance by his attempt to disrespect their late queen, had found their own way to silence his vitriol. "Trump says—" A potato bounced off his shoulder. More produce followed, the morning market across the street providing ample ammunition for the outraged crowd. Tourists from various nations joined in, unity in action, proving stronger than any political division. Jackson's attempted bravado crumbled under the assault. His phone slipped from his grip as he raised his arms to shield his face from the incoming projectiles. His MAGA hat, knocked askew by a well-aimed Brussels sprout, fell to the ground where it was promptly crushed under rushing feet. "This is exactly what Trump meant about you people," he shouted as he began backing away, his designer shoes slipping on smashed vegetables. "You can't handle the truth about your outdated—" A final egg caught him directly in the face, cutting off his words in a splash of yellow. Finally, comprehending that his audience had moved beyond listening to action, Jackson turned and ran. His retreat was hardly dignified, slipping on produce, ducking projectiles, his previously pristine outfit now a canvas of his humiliation. Even in flight, he couldn't resist one final attempt at defiance. "Trump will hear about this," he called over his shoulder, but his words were drowned out by the collective voice of a crowd that had found its own way to defend tradition. "I'll post this online. Everyone will see how you treat American patriots." He stumbled again, another volley of vegetables following his retreat. "Mate," a Cockney accent called out from the crowd, "the only thing people will see is a coward running from his own ignorance." The comment drew appreciative laughter from the gathering, even as Jackson disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a trail of crushed vegetables and wounded pride. The guard hadn't moved throughout this final scene, his posture still perfect, his bearing unchanged. He didn't need to. The public had chosen to become guards of their own tradition in their own way. The veteran picked up Jackson's abandoned flag, carefully folding it with military precision. "Shame he never learned what this really stands for," he remarked quietly, before heading to the palace gate to properly deliver it to the guard's custody. The crowd began to disperse, the morning's improvised ammunition being cleared away by spontaneously organizing tourists. The guard resumed his watch, his posture perfect, his bearing unchanged, yet somehow more magnificent than before. The morning sun caught his brass buttons, no longer targets for mockery, but symbols of a tradition that had once again proven its worth. The scene faded back to normal, but the lesson lingered in the air like an echo. True strength isn't found in loud proclamations or political divisions, but in the quiet dignity of service and the unbreakable bonds between nations. What would you have done in the Guard's position? How do you think we can better honour the shared history between nations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest videos. Also, check out our previous videos appearing on the screen right now for more powerful reminders of what real service and tradition mean.